Okay, so I'm doing an experiment here. Um, I'm Todd Palmer, the instructor for this course in museums, cultural organizations, and social change. And it seems that I do not have the computer set up to do an official New York University broadcast. So as not you're not experiencing more technical delays, I've kind of jerry-rigged um, this Apple device lecture, and we'll just point to the screen, and I will probably also just put this slides as a PDF so you can look at them. Perhaps you can look at the slides with my voice, and I'll kind of cue you up, and you'll have a very bad version as I point to my screen. So I'm here at the offices of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, where I work as the executive director, and we're in the Chicago Cultural Center. And so welcome to this course in Museums, Social Change, Museums, Cultural Institutions, and Social Change. And like a real lecture in real time, it will not be perfect. So I hope this is just a good introduction. So looking at the screen here, we have an image of, I believe this is the Plaza République in Paris, an image from the Carrie James Marshall show in Chicago. One of our readings this week is related to that show, Mastery. It originated here. It's moving on to, well, it already has been in New York. I believe it's already left, and it's on its way to LA. And then finally, an actually image, still reversed. On the right, this is inverted as you look at the screen, but at any rate, downstairs at the Cultural Center, a public space that also exhibits art and every other year exhibits the Chicago Architecture Biennial. This image is of during the women's marches a few months ago. Some of the placards were left in the museum. So what all these have together is they're tied by a central question I'd like to pose for your consideration in this course, which is really, what is the public nature of the museum? What is the civic responsibility of the museum? And there's different kind of frameworks that this might be talked about in terms of social justice or social change. For the particular title for this course, we're using the word social impact, but in my mind, that word includes both justice and change, and we can discuss the nuances and differences between those things. But ultimately, they're all asking civic questions of museums and cultural institutions. Further, I believe posing that question gets us to thinking about the museum as a space. It does many things. It welcomes, it orients. It's a site that gets programmed, and we can think of programming, lectures, and talks, but we can also think of teaching. We can think of the museum as a kind of celebration, of edification at different times. Those things have different valences, or people have different ideas about what it means to teach. Is it top-down, or is it more inclusive? But it's also a space that often houses critique, that often becomes a site for talkback, even for protest. And so I like this image of the protest sign getting left behind, and a space that gets occupied over time. So you'll look at one of the readings, which is the Victoria Newhouse, Art and the Power of Placement. And as you read that, and also think about some of the references that you'll find in the Carrie James Marshall and his project to really put race and images of Blackness into the museum, how the civic purpose of the museum from its very origins has always had this kind of tension between the highest ideas of a society and often the most empowered individuals in a society who historically, when we had kings and such, were the ones that had the authority to set those ideas, and then others on the margins, and those margins shift over time, who have pushed back against those values or what is included or excluded. And so you'll see a kind of oblique reference in the Marshall piece to this idea that David was part, the artist David now, was part of the founding of the Louvre at the moment that the palace of the king was taken over. And I like this idea that artists acting sort of as curators, taking over a home and that was itself a place that art had been shown, and take it over and really rethink what art gets to be put up and what is the purpose of that structure. And in a way, the museum, even as exclusive as it may seem today, comes out of a kind of radical impulse, which I find interesting and I'd like us to talk about, and to see that as much as we can think that museums are being pushed to revolutionize themselves in some ways, and in a very incomplete way, it's part of their DNA in their origin. So these images are sort of intended to inspire these kind of thoughts as you do the readings this week. Going on to our second image, if I can make this work. And I trust this is still recording. Hello, yes it is. This is a very Rube Goldberg, but it's actually a good introduction to who I am. So if it was perfect, maybe next time it'll be perfect. You'll lose a little bit of my personality. So speaking of personality and histories, the second set of images really gets at what I want this introduction to be, which is to say that while this is a new course at NYU, and in many ways, to have coursework about museums and social impact is somewhat of a new thing, maybe in the last 5, perhaps 10 years, over the course of an institutional history which dates back into the 18th century, if not before. I'd like to pose at this idea of the social or civic mission of the museum, while new and at the forefront and maybe new to be explicitly attended to, actually has a history. And I evidently just a few minutes ago alluded to that in talking about David and the Louvre. But I'd also like to just introduce my own history, and so we could kind of think of today and this week, this first set of sessions, or this first unit of the course, if you will, to be about these two intersecting histories. So there's a history of my work in museums, at the same time, a history of museums, and I would argue in a certain way that my most recent project, which was as the curator and associate director of the National Public Housing Museum here in Chicago, was a point at which these two histories kind of come into conflict, or into a kind of creative tension, perhaps not so much of a conflict. But so if that title hasn't already given you pause as you've read my resume or looked into my biography, it was the kind of title of museum that could raise eyebrows if you told someone sitting next to you on an airline seat. So how is it that there could be a museum of public housing? And certainly, if there were to be such a museum, it was a museum that was very much concerned about this, the nature of museums as sites of social impact. And so these three images just display the site of the museum itself, which grows out of activism of a local Chicago community of public housing residents who were faced with the demolition of their neighborhood and homes. And so actually this green space that you see, if you look carefully, there's actually young women playing lacrosse. At the time, that green space was actually other buildings like this. So there was a complex of 30-odd buildings built during the New Deal to house working class, mostly 98% in fact, white residents of Chicago, white immigrants. And by the 90s, that kind of experiment in public housing had largely been determined to be a failure by the powers that be. So in that moment, these women decided to rally to save one building, which is still standing, to be a monument. And you see in this kind of second image a model of the museum or this structure as monument turned museum. And they won allies in the historic preservation movement, in the public interest design movement, and also allied themselves with a movement within the museum world, the International Sites of Conscience, which was founded at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York. And they were able to begin the process of turning this into a museum, which I joined as a volunteer in about 2011, and then on staff as their first curator in 2013. And in 2015, I was able to take that work, which I'll speak more about, I'm sure, during the duration of this course, and open this ruin to the public as part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and to begin to introduce the notion that this building could serve some of the progressive purposes of advocates who would like to see housing considered to be a human right. So one of the questions that we faced actually as an institution getting from a ruin to an exhibition was how in fact would a museum serve these kind of larger purposes, and an investment in an institution which has such, in certain circles, connotations of elitism and exclusion. How would you we were asked on one side, how would you co-opt or direct the energies and sort of functions of a museum to serve these sort of radical purposes? And on the other hand, there are folks in this neighborhood, perhaps parents of kids playing lacrosse, who would wonder why something so roundly disparaged and in some ways horrifying to some people, why would you elevate it? So this is the model of the Museum Under Glass. Like, museums are places we put precious, valued, treasured, high in many people's minds objects. And so why would you turn this into a museum? So there, on both ends of the kind of political spectrum, you could say there was this doubt about this collision between public housing, progressive action, and this kind of conservative notion of a museum. So I like those questions, actually. Evidently, I like them because I worked with them for several years until October, when I started this job at the Biennial. But I'm still very concerned with the questions that were posed, and that somehow I do believe that museums are potential and potent vehicles for social change, social justice, and social impact. And the way I'd like for us to frame this possibility, and I very much pose it as a possibility. So this is not a course to give you the answers necessarily, because it's work that's still being done. It's work that's challenging. That folks who are doing this work are in discussion and sometimes in debate about the best ways forward. So I invite you into those kind of discussions and questions. But at any rate, to me, in the framework of this course, thinking about space is helpful. The museum is a particular kind of space, and I'm probably a little bit biased to think in terms of space because my background is in architecture originally, and then secondarily in exhibition design, and then through those two backgrounds, I moved into work as a curator, and now as a museum administrator or an arts administrator in the management of an institution. A lot of across those different sort of hats that I've worn, questions of space, how you use space to exhibit as a curator or exhibit designer, but as an administrator of a cultural institution, an associate director or director, one has to ask how one uses space between collections or exhibitions or education. And then that gets into who has the authority to program those spaces and what's important and what's not. What are the boundaries between the different parts of a museum? So in a way, this image here, which is titled Social Impact, what is included in this museum? So one of the questions we had at Public Housing, this Museum of Public Housing, what's included? Are collections included? Are historical materials included? Whose stories are included? This is a picture of a former resident of public housing when it was integrated. And how many stories do we tell of this time when there were Jews and Italians living in public housing versus when later in the 70s it was 100% Black and remained so through its demise in the 90s? So who decides that? And who's at the table? Who decides who's at the table? Who works at the museum? Who governs the museum? What are the materials included? How much space or time is devoted to exhibitions versus education versus outreach? All these questions versus architecture. How do you decide? It's resource questions. And then these, evidently the inputs, I hope it's evident, the inputs into museums being resources and personnel very much relate to the outcomes of a museum, what we see as a public. I'd like us, as we move into some of the later segments of this course, to really think about the behind-the-scenes decisions of the work that is seen externally. And we'll talk a lot about innovative ways to program and do outreach and to do exhibitions that make museums more socially impactful. But in order to do that work, museums often have to look deep inside themselves at how they operate and function. So perhaps this is a point where we begin to pivot from my experience in this particular museum, still looking at images of the Museum of Public Housing, and think about the museum itself having a history which begins to get at some of these structural questions of who runs museums and how people understand their missions and what their limits are, what their opportunities are. So in that, we'll look briefly. It's the most cursory history, and in this way, I hope you do spend some time with the reading of Victoria Newhouse, which is not the most thorough, but I think it's a nice kind of survey through the lens of exhibition and display of the different politics and economics actually comes into politics, of how those different politics and economics define different ways that the institution as a space is situated. So, but in very simple terms, we could say that at this moment that these palaces are taken over, appropriated as public spaces, the museum comes into being, and it's interesting that they are spaces of residence. They house things, and they house art, but they shelter as well. And this, for coming from a public housing museum, the idea of turning housing into a museum, it was helpful for us actually to think through the idea that the museum itself has a residue of being a palace or a place that a few people lived, and it suddenly opened up in that, and there's a kind of radical impulse, I think, in that idea of turning the public inside out and turning the private rather inside out and making it public. So the legacy of the museum is a legacy of elites, but it's also a legacy of critical disruptions at different moments. And perhaps we're at the moment where the most popular or the most mainstream, and also in some cases the most marginal, all feel that they have a stake in a museum. And it's slowly taking kind of the power to display, the power to decide, the power to exhibit away from a very limited number of people. But the museum also has a history. So very shortly after the Louvre is taken over, it's kind of reappropriated as a space of power because it becomes, and you'll see a reference to this, I believe, in the reading this week as well, a place to put plunder on display. And so natural history museums are very much evidence of a moment of global empire making where things are discovered, things are taken, whether they're marbles from Greece or dinosaur bones in the American West, and brought from their original settings into the hubs of civilization, whether that be Chicago or London or New York or Los Angeles. This slide here is just another way of framing these questions, which are in the readings this week, through some alternative imagery, and posing that at different moments, not so recently, it's important to know that these moments of resistance or rethinking are not all happening yesterday or in the last 10 years. But this is an image of the Menil Museum during, a Houston museum and its origins. And there's a very traditional notion of power, the curator, who happens to be the collector, Dominique de Menil, laying out the art in a kind of dollhouse form. So there's a certain kind of one-to-one relationship between who has the power to collect the money and who has the power to decide where things go. On the other hand, also a post-war project, this time in Sao Paulo, reinstalled, but based on the vision of Lina Bobardi, who is a woman architect, who has a very sort of contra view that using her power as the architect, but to open up the space of curation and decision to the public. So the concept here is that the entire collection, instead of being on the walls, and I'm just going to go back a slide, of a palace, of a, or in this case, it's a public space, but still the connoisseur has the power to decide how these walls are displayed. So there are no walls. The work of art, which in her mind, she's a Marxist, are works of plunder. They're bought and sold. You can see the backs, you can see the provenance, you can see who owned them and where they've been. But you also see them as works of labor. So for her, it's very important to think that the work of art is not, just an image that you're looking into some window, into some other view or some sort of conception, but that it's work, that someone has labored, someone has toiled. And in many cases, they have not been paid as well as, say, the collectors who buy and sell at auction. So she's making that all very explicit. And so for me, these are just posing, as we talk about social impact, two different ideas of the museum where the outcome, the exhibition or the programming, what you learn, is very much tied to kind of choices made that are more invisible, and into concerns of power and decision making. And to I think in this course I'd like to always look on both sides, as we don't end discussions about a great program that will invite people in to do X, Y, and Z, or to talk about issues, or but that we're also thinking about like our own position in making decisions, or basically systems and structures are behind everything, and that will be something we talk quite a lot about. A final kind of, in this chronology, if we're just jumping from the 60s to the 2008, fast forward, my history of getting to this course is I've actually been teaching exhibit design since 2006, and during that time period, there have been a series of kind of crises that museums have faced, from a fiscal crisis in 2008 to more discussion around 2010 or into 2012 of a kind of demographic crisis, that the nature of who goes to museums will change as the complexion of major Western democracies, including the United States, changes and becomes more weighted to people of color. But during that time, museums have sort of had to take a hard look at how rooted they are in the sort of palatial model. Certainly, it's not the purview of emperors and kings, but all these museums displayed here, infusions of massive wealth, and this idea of a Bilbao effect, that you could hire a major global architect and build a great, ostensibly public palace, but that would bring tourists and fuel economies and be a kind of common point of civic pride. And that model has proven not to work. And in one of these recent weeks, we'll look at a study from the University of Chicago that gets at some of the metrics of why and how that didn't work. But it is a framework for the course, is to say that changing demographics, the changing economies, the way that's put pressure on political constructs, from Brexit to the recent election of Trump, are behind how we think and talk about social impact in this course, and some of the concerns that you might have as a museum administrator tie very much into a changing set of social dynamic, whether you're talking about multilingualism or inclusion or the economics of museums, which set into questions of, what deserves funding. We're seeing the NEA and NEH threatened with cuts, framed in terms of, well, who cares? These are places for elites, so a poor, and I'm paraphrasing, but what does a poor farmer in Indiana care about funding for the arts, which is to say funding for cultural organizations? So clearly talking about social impact has no choice but to grapple with the actual political and economic context of living on the planet today. And so I say planet, because the environment is also another factor in how we think about these things. So coming to a close for you to do the readings, I'd like to think about, the museum in a very holistic way, that they contain many departments and many kind of public-facing outcomes from exhibitions to education, and that together these define what we can think about the possibilities of social impact being. Everything from how museums function, their spaces, how they define who's welcomed, who's housed, who comes in and out, who works there. And so that at the end of the day, they don't just represent content, whether that's art, content, or history, but they really make history, they really make societies, they really define the stage of civic concern and even more importantly, today. So as you do the readings, and there is a reading that's literally an article just coming out in the last few weeks, and I'll post some specific questions in the assignment, you to introduce yourselves and how your history is relevant to the way you frame the way you'll think about these answers, but I'd also like to begin a discussion about some of the prompts. So I think that's enough of a lecture, 27 minutes. I look forward to being in discussion with you, and that concludes today's course.